series recently crossing its 30-year anniversary, and as we've patiently waited a decade for any sort of screen adaptation, it's time to take a look at the potentially immortal story of a vampire, the Belmonts, and a little game we know as Castlevania. Akumajou Dracula was a Famicom game for Konami released in Japan in 1986 and adapted for release in the US under the title Castlevania. It introduced video gamers to Simon Belmont, a member of the vampire hunting family, the Belmont clan. The name was changed upon foreign release as Konami's senior vice president, Emil Heidkamp, found it a bit uncomfortable in its direct translation, Devil Castle Dracula, and insisted on not having any religious connotations. The game was also released for the home computer from MSX, but wasn't a direct port and was more a unique adaptation of the first installment. Instead of these seamless stages, the MSX version forced the player to only explore one area at a time, one screen at a time, in order to find hidden treasures and ultimately a skeleton key to advance. The game was never released stateside, but was distributed in Europe under the title Vampire Killer. The sequel, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, released shortly after, and introduced an experience point system found often in role-playing games, and would also cycle between day and night, changing the strength of the enemies Simon encountered. Comparative in gameplay to the adventures of Link, Simon's Quest also had a rather exploratory world similar to Metroid, and has many features found in the game's successors. Oftentimes, gaming companies would develop the arcade first before porting to the home entertainment systems. But Castlevania, having already released to the home market, colored outside the cabinet with the release of Haunted Castle in 1988. Suffering from a delay in scheduling and a short staff, it is no wonder that the Castlevania arcade was not quite considered a success, and has been considered the most difficult of the series by fans of the franchise. A year later, straight to our Game Boys came the Castlevania Adventure. Seen as a rather weak installment in the series, players took control of Christopher Belmont through 4 stages with no secondary weapons, only 3 lives, and a timer to complete each stage. The game left a bitter taste in critics' mouths, and was reviewed as rather slow at times and with nothing original to offer. Luckily, the 3rd installment, and last for the NES, came in the form of Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse. Viewed by some as the best in the series, the story revolves around Trevor Belmont, and allows for a player at multiple times to choose between 2 paths to take, which also allows for gamers to experience multiple endings to the game itself. Next up was the Japanese release Demon Castle Special: I'm Kid Dracula by Konami for the Famicom. Viewed as a parody of the series itself, this childlike departure did release a sequel, Kid Dracula, for Game Boy. It wasn't long before Konami got back to the nitty-gritty with Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge, the second title in the series for the Game Boy. It was praised for its return to classic Castlevania items and weapons, and was seen as a better game than its predecessor. Then came the upgrade to the Super Nintendo with 1991's Super Castlevania IV. Acclaimed by critics, the game sold 500,000 copies worldwide, partly thanks to its unique and mature look and style. Japan then released Akumajou Dracula for the X68000, a popular personal computer overseas. This 1993 game, released on floppy disks, wouldn't be seen by American gamers for nearly a decade when it was released on PlayStation as Castlevania Chronicles. Japan also released Rondo of Blood for the Super CD-ROM. Receiving positive reviews, Electronic Gaming Monthly even stated that it may just be the best CD title yet, and were quick to point out its one drawback: no American release. Though in 1994, another odd business decision was made as Castlevania Bloodlines was released for the Sega Genesis. The only game of the franchise to be released for the system, it became an instant hit and is often considered an overlooked classic. With a massive amount of fans wanting to play Rondo of Blood, they finally got their chance, sort of, with the release of Dracula X for the SNES. Having altered the art style, levels, and even playability of specific characters from its original incarnation, players were disappointed. Sometimes, patience is a virtue, and fans waited for 2 more years before the next game in the franchise, but it was the cult classic that everyone had been waiting for. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was released on the PlayStation in 1997. Symphony became a smash hit thanks to critics and word of mouth, and has since been re-released on multiple systems. A year later saw the franchise hitting the Game Boy for the 3rd and final time, with Castlevania Legends. Despite being considered a cult classic, Castlevania producer Koji Igarashi has erased this game from the traditional timeline of the franchise due to conflicting events, and has even gone as far as calling the game an embarrassment. Jumping on board with the 3D movement, Nintendo launched Castlevania 64. For the first time, players could navigate through Dracula's castle, and though old-school fans of the franchise felt mixed about the prospect, overall it didn't receive terrible reviews. An updated and expanded edition of this game was released later that year. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness featured new levels, streamlined controls, and focused on a prequel story to 64. Gameplay turned side-scroller again for the Game Boy Advance when Castlevania Circle of the Moon released in 2001. Positively received, Circle sold 1 million copies in a month. This title, along with Legacy, were also removed from the timeline by Koji Igarashi, who had developed previous titles in the franchise as well as the follow-up, the Game Boy Advance's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. The third and final Game Boy Advance Castlevania title came out in 2003. Aria of Sorrow, led again by Igarashi, received critical acclaim and was considered the best of the Game Boy Advance games in the franchise. Making its debut on the PlayStation 2 came Lament of Innocence, the third of the series to use three-dimensional graphics. Intended to be a new starting point for the series, and directed once again by Igarashi, Lament received positive reviews and was even used in part in a scholarly analysis of religion in video games. The commercially successful Dawn of Sorrow, the sequel to Aria of Sorrow, made its debut on the Nintendo DS in 2005. That same year, Konami developed Curse of Darkness, another three-dimensional Castlevania game for the Xbox and PS2. Curse of Darkness was also adapted into a 2-volume manga from Tokyo Pop. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, released for the Nintendo DS a year later, was the first of the series to feature multiplayer cooperative gameplay. A continuation of Bloodlines, Portrait of Ruin's 2-player mode was an homage to Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, Igarashi's favorite game of the series. As with all things, when they fly high for too long, something has to give, and give it did, with Order of Shadows. A game said to have little to no replay value was released to be played exclusively on mobile phones. However, in the vein of keeping it small, the PlayStation Portable PSP saw the premiere of Dracula X Chronicles the same year. A partial remake of Rondo of Blood, the game was later re-released under the Greatest Hits banner and has achieved mostly positive reviews. And the praise wasn't over, as Castlevania Order of Ecclesia for the Nintendo DS was given an A- from 1UP.com and praised for having the ability to breathe new life into the series. Then came the slightly off-the-mark and aptly titled Castlevania Judgment. Released for the Wii, Judgment was the first fighting game of the series, because why not? Well, judged it was. Igarashi blamed it partially on the Wii Remote's movement, whereas critics blamed it on everything else, from character design to camera work to player controls. The game was a financial failure in Japan. In 2009 came the release of Castlevania the Arcade in both Europe and Japan, where 1 to 2 players using an LED remote could control the whip to attack enemies. But in case you weren't in those countries and were still jonesing for the next release, WiiWare had you taken care of with Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. It was part of the Rebirth series that featured Gradius and Contra, and was based on the 1989 Game Boy title Castlevania The Adventure. Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night was released for the iOS and Windows Phone, and told the story of Symphony of the Night a la the Puzzle Fighter Tetris style of gameplay. Unlike the previous mobile attempt, Encore received generally positive reviews. Harmony of Despair for Xbox Live Arcade and the PlayStation Network received somewhat mixed reviews upon release, partly because of the gameplay format. Though a side-scroller again, featuring characters and many other elements from previous titles, the game relies heavily on the multiplayer mode, in which players can team up to conquer one of the 6 maps and defeat the main boss. Additional stages and characters were added later as downloadable content. Released in 2010 on the Xbox 360 and PS3, Castlevania Lords of Shadow, a reboot of the series, came forth in part thanks to it being produced by the legendary creator of Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima. Receiving positive reviews caused the game to spin off 2 more sequels, Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate and Lords of Shadow 2. Besides the video games, Castlevania has also made its leap to cartoons via DiC Animation with appearances in Captain N the Game Master. This classic animated series is a must for Castlevania and Nintendo fans alike. With toys, calendars, slot machines, comic adaptations, an array of soundtrack releases, and with Netflix recently announcing their forthcoming 2017 animated series, Castlevania, like its antagonist, proves to be immortal. Like the video? Have suggestions? Comment below and please be sure to subscribe.